Hi, welcome to my new channel. I wanted to use this first opportunity to talk about the idea of feminism and video games, and kind of look at some really brief points from both sides, separate out sort of fact from fiction, and give you some kind of starting point, or maybe just a continuing analysis, of, well, this very sort of controversial issue which has been rumbling on for like months now, way more than any other issue I remember sort of coming across, except something like Ubisoft. Um, the first point I want to sort of put forward is the idea of women getting paid only 75% of what a man gets, which is a statistic that's often used by women and feminists, not just in the case of video games, of course, but in sort of wider society as part of the feminist movement. And one of the big problems against that is the idea that there's legislation in place to stop that. There's laws that stop you discriminating against women in the workplace. The problem is it's on a more cultural level where things like this affect. And this is why this sort of debate exists, because the cultural really matters in society a lot more than many of us even think. And oftentimes we aren't even aware of it. I'm certainly not until I read about it, and that seems to make so much sense. In this case, we often find women tend to be the weaker characters. They tend to be the one that is getting saved. That's not just in video games, that's in fiction or fairy tales or movies or whatever, any medium. The problem with that, though, is that from a really early age, that sort of cements the idea of women as the sort of weaker party. That leads to the whole pay gap thing, because there's not a gap there because employers are being deliberately sexist and they're, going against women and all the rest of it, and they're just deliberately giving men more because that's illegal. The problem is, men will often have the confidence to get another job because they're seen as the strong breadwinner. And so, where that confidence comes into play is that they hold off. They get better offers from the employers, whereas women don't. And so, women, because of this sort of culture, are more likely to go for a job before men do. And that's one aspect of why women, and feminists, of course, may tend to sort of criticize the view of video games, but not just video games and also other entertainment mediums. That's the first sort of big point from the feminists. But what I also want to say is another one, which is that feminists aren't as cohesive as some people might think. Some people think that it is just a group which is really anti anything in any shape, sort of, against women, which isn't true. The biggest example is probably that of Bayonetta. And the reason that's really big is because some people think it's sexist, some people think it isn't. And the reason is because there's an aspect of choice there. And that's what's really key between some games and others. So what I would say is, look at Bayonetta, and yes, the camera sort of looks at the character in weird ways if you've played it, and all that sort of stuff. But the character itself seems to have the free choice. The character itself wears sort of revealing clothes and does all this sort of stuff, based on the character's own kind of mind, and based on their own free will. Compare that to something like Dead or Alive, and every female character in that. Or even compare that to something like just random women walking about in San Andreas or something. The characters are really different, and they are more just like objects, just to be looked at, with no consciousness and no choice whatsoever. And so, the biggest point about that is that we don't need games to totally change. Feminists don't want, well, at least some don't, want nudity or sort of revealing stuff or whatever removed entirely from games. And that's not the point. They just want it so that, if that is there, there might be some kind of sort of free will aspect. So there is no sort of, dodginess or sort of questionability about it. One last thing I want to say is that there's often the argument that comes from people who look at people getting offended in a sort of feminist way and say, if you don't like it, then don't play the games. The problem is, that doesn't really help anything. If you look at something like film, where it's over the course of sort of 100 years became more and more accepted, there's more and more option and more choice as for what to see nowadays. What we're seeing with video games nowadays is that Papers, Please gets just as much media coverage, even more actually, than something like Call of Duty. How that affects is that if we have this whole big debate around women, and it seems like there prevails this idea of gamers as not wanting women to play games, then there's going to be a lot less people playing games and feeling comfortable playing games. Think about those really big budget games. Those big budgets come from somewhere, and that's because of the promise of lots and lots of people playing them. If gaming has this sort of not favourable atmosphere around it, then the problem is you're going to have less money going towards those big games, and obviously you're going to have less choice and less developed games because you have obviously less developers, but when we keep demanding more, there's only one way that can go. And so that's not saying that you need to be a feminist. It's not saying that you need to support any of the things that feminists want, but it's more just keeping the debate civil, and there's more a point about creating a sort of more debating atmosphere as opposed to something that seems a little bit more antagonistic, from both sides, of course, not just from gamers against feminists, but obviously vice versa as well. But yeah, pretty much, those are some sort of main points I wanted to bring up. Just my 2 cents, you don't need to be a feminist to agree. But yeah, like, subscribe, comment, keep the debate going, and I hope I'll be back soon with another slightly less contentious video. Until then, signing off.